we now present a conversation with Wolfgang Schmidt. Wolfgang Schmidt is a state secretary at the Federal Ministry of Finance here in Germany, in Berlin. And he has been a close advisor to our Vice Chancellor Olaf Scholz for many, many years. And by the way, he's also a strong and long supporter of the progressive governance conferences and has attended many times. Wolfgang Schmidt is particularly interesting now because he is one of the driving forces behind the German-French Initiative for a Recovery Fund, and it will be insightful to understand how he assesses the situation in Europe from a government perspective, and if he thinks that a political union is feasible or will be feasible. Wolfgang is in conversation with Cerstin Gammelin. She is the deputy head of the Berlin office of Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the biggest daily newspapers we have in Germany. And she knows German politics very well, but she also knows Brussels good, as she was the EU correspondent for her paper for many years. And I now hear that they are started already, they are sending already. I think we should go right in then. Yeah, let's start.
Chancellor Merkel has been now for 16 years in charge, and also being the big person of the European politics. And your SPD took over the finance ministry, where the German European policy is also included. So basically, and you mentioned Chancellor Merkel already, so basically the question is, how did you convince the Chancellor, or did you have to convince the Chancellor to support the proposal that was created or presented from the finance ministry? So first of all, how did you convince Merkel? And the second, there's not only Merkel, but also CDU, CSU, your coalition partner, and very well known to opposite everything what seems like burden sharing in the European Union. So how did you do that?
I would say the crisis did, and obviously, I mean, Olaf Scholz is a very convincing guy, and he had several discussions with Chancellor Merkel. But I wouldn't say that it was necessary to overcome something or to really convince her. It was lots of discussions that they had, and that also the ministry with the colleagues in the chancellery had, and I would say that everybody, including people in the Conservative Party, in the CDU, realized very early on that this was a historic moment. No? And Chancellor Merkel said it in public that this is probably the biggest crisis since the Second World War, and this is the crisis that this generation has to face. And you could see that both in the national answer, the famous bazooka, or also the boldness of our reaction, also when it comes to the numbers of all the different packages. But you could also see it on the discussion on the European level. And if you recall, we had some moments where there was a more theoretical discussions about whether we should have a Corona or Euro bonds. And we always thought this is not leading somewhere. We need to focus on what is really needed. And what was needed in the beginning, at the first phase, was an immediate support and help, especially financial help, hence the three elements. And now it's the time to think about the recovery, and especially what is going to happen this year and the next year. So to react to the impact that this pandemic has on the different European economies. And we all know that the capacity, the fiscal space of different European economies and member states is different. So it didn't really need a lot of convincing, but it then emerged, and obviously there were different proposals, there were different ideas how this could be done. I think at the end, we found a very intelligent solution saying, look, any normal budget lives out of own resources, that is taxes mainly, and then you also always have an element of issuing bonds and going into debt. which is not problematic if it is controlled and if it is up to a certain limit. And what we are now making possible for the European Commission is just doing this. And obviously, and that is then the Hamiltonian moment that Olaf Scholz mentioned, saying, okay, if we go this step for one time measure, we should also think about genuine own resources for the European Commission.
Yeah.
That would then later on add to this first step in that Hamiltonian moment.
That basically brings me to the next question. This proposal is for now, it's for the next European budget. But do you think this is really now a change for the European Union and also for the following budgets? Or is this just because of the Corona crisis, we have this now here, but then afterwards we go back to business as usual as it was before the Corona crisis?
I mean, it's always difficult to predict the future, but we all know that Europe has always evolved and improved in times of crises. No? And as Churchill put it, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think this is exactly the moment. So meanwhile, it is at the moment a once, I wouldn't say in a lifetime, but an element or an instrument for this one-off instrument for this situation. It will open a new chapter in fiscal and financial integration of the EU. And there is already discussion, and there is somehow a happy coincidence having this crisis actually at the moment when we already have come to the end of the discussion on the so-called multi-annual financial framework, so the EU budget for the next 7 years. And it needs to be ended, this discussion, by, as you know, by the end of December 2020, so we can combine that question on the overall budget, the MFF, with the discussion on the European Recovery Fund. And so that we have a lot of material for the great bargain that is always happening on the European level. And so that there's enough elements for a compromise that then will include all the 27 member states.
Yeah. And on top, the third good thing is that the Germans have the EU presidency, to which we come later on. Basically, one last question to our big proposal. I mean, the question is, from your point of view, is this really the Hamiltonian moment now? And is it really possible to introduce in the European Union also a fiscal union with all these key elements of debt issuance, fiscal transfers, revenue raising, and a centralized governance? Is this feasible? And first of all, is this politically deliverable?
Maybe one step at another. I would say we should leave it at the end to the historians and to the scientists and the economists judging whether this is or has been the Hamiltonian moment. But I think politically, and that is why Olaf Scholz introduced it in the debate again, there are elements. No? And if we now allow the European Union to issue their own bonds and to go to the markets and seek for financial support, so running a deficit and indebting themselves, that is one element. We are already discussing about own resources. So, for example, tapping on existing models like the European trading system for emission rights, or the financial transaction tax modeled after the French law. So there are elements. Obviously, we won't see a real European government in the fiscal sphere, but for example, making majority decisions possible in the Council when it comes to taxation would be a huge step forward, and introducing a minimum taxation on the European level to allow a level playing field is another element. So I would say there are elements, and this crisis could actually trigger an openness to go another step. And it adds on something that Olaf Scholz in, I think it was November, already proposed, to the surprise of many, saying that, look, we need to complete the banking union. And he even mentioned a word that was kind of taboo for Germans, the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, as part of a package. And I would say this is exactly how Europe works. And maybe to give you a little insight also in how Olaf Scholz operates, when he started his job in March 2018, he spent nearly a year talking to all the other European colleagues, trying to figure out where the red lines for them are, what kind of interest they have. And then he discussed in 2 all-nighters until 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning with Bruno Le Maire, his French colleague. And that then led to this German-Franco agreement in Meseberg in June 2018, I mentioned at the beginning. So it is a constant work. And I think now there is, unfortunately, due to this crisis, the moment to actually bring Europe forward.
Let's stay a bit, I think, in the political environment. Since we are talking a lot about Europe's future, we have to take into consideration that next year we will face a federal election, and the year after also the election in France. And especially for Germany, I would say it's clear, you never know what happens, but so far it's clear that Chancellor Merkel will not run again for the chancellery, so we will have a big change. So, and there's a big question mark to the SPD, and perhaps we can start with the question, all these European projects you described now, they sound very interesting. Do you think the SPD would be willing also to go or to make a European election campaign, or an election campaign with Europe, like the French president did 4 years ago?
I think Europe will always be part of any, not only election campaign, but any political platform of any German political party, because Europe is such an integral part of German national politics nowadays that you can't really separate it. I wouldn't go as far as saying that Germans would probably, like the French, base their vote and their voting behavior on what the parties say about Europe. But when it comes to sovereignty, when it comes to Germany's role in the world, this can only work within the European Union. And that is why I'm pretty sure that the question of how to deal with the European Union, what our ideas for a deeper integration and also for the role of the European Union will always play a big part in any election campaign. But there are several other questions, obviously, as well. I mean, the crisis will bring to the focus of the political debate old questions that were a little bit at the fringes, and this will be the question of how to restart the economy, later on also how to redistribute, and also the question who actually pays for some of the measures that we have. And that will be a question on a European level, but it will also be a question here in Germany.
Yeah, I would like to stay 1 second with the SPD, the Social Democrats. I mean, what we have seen last time, there was a candidate running for Chancellor, Martin Schulz, coming from Europe, but he was not, I would not say allowed, but at the end he decided not to run with Europe his candidacy. So do you think it was the right choice? And is it more that the SPD would say we need Europe, as you mentioned it, we need Europe, and Germany needs Europe, or is it that the SPD is more also from the feeling saying, so we like this continent, we like our continent, and we want to be together, not only for economic reasons?
I think what the crisis showed us is that how important Europe is. I mean, we saw out of a sudden internal borders were closed. And you might recall the celebration on the border between Poland and Germany when it was finally reopened again. And we know about the foreign ministers going to Luxembourg about the opening of the border. So I think people realized how important Europe is for us, and how strange it feels to have out of a sudden border controls or even closed borders again. And then people also, I think, realized that Europe is important if we want to have a saying on the international level. And we saw that if we have restrictions on export, for example, on medical masks, that is something that is completely against the European idea. So my guess is that people will be happy to discuss about Europe. And the interesting part is there were recent polls after the Franco-German proposal was announced, saying that not only are we willing to pay more for Europe, but also we would like to see this recovery fund also giving grants to other European countries. And the German public actually said, that's good. And confidence in what Germany and Germany's government is doing in Europe actually grew by a few percentage points. So I'm confident that there is a majority of people understanding that Europe is in Germany's best interest. Hence, the fact that Olaf Scholz from the very beginning and the whole Social Democratic Party is stressing that, including actually, and this is also in the coalition agreement, saying that we are willing to pay more for Europe, which is unheard of from Germany, I would say. But this is kind of the heritage of Martin Schulz as well, who negotiated especially this first chapter and made sure that Europe is at the center of this coalition treaty. And now we see that the ideas laid out by Martin Schulz and others are actually implemented step by step.
Since you mentioned chapter 1 of the coalition treaty, that is indeed Europe, and that Germany announced that it's willing to pay more for the EU budget and also for the European Union. There were I have to ask you, there were figures out recently that the German contribution will increase by 42%. Is there any truth to that, or can you give us the figure you have? Since you are in the finance ministry, you have in mind for the German contribution for the EU?
No, the figure of the 42%, and there was a lively discussion on Twitter already, is not correct, because it is complicated. The multi-annual financial framework, as I said, is a 7-year-long one. So you have to see what you compare. The question is always how much of the national income will be distributed to Europe. And this is between, let's say, 1.0 and 1.2%. And this is, at the moment, the negotiations. Everybody knows that due to the crisis, contributions will be higher. But also from a negotiation point of view, I would be stupid to now explaining the German position here, because this is something that needs to be done in the negotiations. But we have to keep in mind it's not only Germany that is at the table. You have heard of the so-called Frugal Four, including some member states that are actually run by progressive governments, and we have to keep their interests in mind as well. And we know that especially our Nordic friends have some difficulties in increasing their contribution to the European budget. And so, as always in Europe, we have to find a compromise that takes into consideration the different positions of the different member states.
When you listen to people here in Germany, some of them, or a lot of them, are Europe friendly, but often you can hear the phrase, so at the end Germany's anyhow paying for everybody in Europe. How comes it to that myth? Because, for instance, Italy is also a net payer and others are net payers. So what is your explanation that the Germans always think they would pay for everybody else? And so what is your solution to come to the reality in that discussion?
Well, it's a little bit similar to discussions that we have in the inner German discussion. We have something that is called the Länderfinanzausgleich, so a redistribution mechanism between the 16 states, the Länder and the federal level. And you have some that are net contributors that are complaining all the time. I personally come from a city-state, Hamburg, and we have been net contributors throughout the existence of that mechanism, with the exception, I think, of 2 or 3 years. We never complained because we know that Hamburg and the port of Hamburg, without the rest of the 15 state, couldn't survive. And I'd say it has something to do how this discourse is framed in Germany, and that is why I'm so happy that not only in the coalition agreement but also in speeches and talks of the political class there is a change, I would say, and we've seen a change throughout the last years, talking about the benefits of Europe, and hence I would say the support of this idea of Germany actually contributing even more to Europe, because people, and the crisis just proved it. If borders to Italy are closed, if northern Italy and its economy is shut down, we have a problem with our supply chain for the automobile industry, because parts of it are in Italy. Or for Airbus, it is a truly European company, and if Spain is in lockdown, then there are parts missing that need to be in Hamburg so that production can continue. And you can tell these stories all over Europe. And so it's not only about the net contribution to the European budget, but I'd say people now realize that it is much more about the European economy. Now it is also about tourism. And so we all know that Germany and many other countries benefit greatly from Europe.
Before we come to the EU presidency, the German EU presidency, I would like to focus a few moments on Merkel and Merkel's goodbye, also from the European stage. What would you think, or what do you expect will change when Merkel is leaving? So how would you, or how could you imagine will a post-Merkel European policy look like? So is this the goodbye of austerity or the welcome for a new sovereignty? What would you think?
Well, first of all, there is a good tradition in Germany that our foreign and European policy does not really depend on the people doing it, but there is a common sense or common ground for good European politics. And secondly, obviously, it depends who will succeed her. And this is still in the open. But I can say if it were the Social Democrats, I would clearly see a clear pro-European approach. And when it comes to what you mentioned, the austerity, I mean, we are actually tomorrow will pass the second supplementary budget for Germany that will at the end have new debt in total of over 210 billion euro. So to portray Mrs. Merkel as the czar of austerity might actually not be true any longer. I think what is true is that we have to adapt to situations, and this is a completely new situation, both for Germany and for Europe. So obviously,
so
Merkel leaving.
No, sorry.
I mean,
is it the end of a Europe we have knowing for the last 16 years?
That's difficult to say. I think that we have seen great stress for Europe, no? Both in the 2010 aftermath of the financial crisis, the Euro crisis, the Greek situation, then the refugee situation in 2015. And we saw the fragmentation. We saw that centrifugal forces within the European Union took place. So Europe is obviously at a critical point, but we also see that this crisis can bring the best of Europe together, and even though at the beginning we saw some not so good developments regarding the confiscating masks and closing down borders unilaterally, I would say both the leaders and especially the finance ministers got their things together and started acting accordingly, and to the level of the challenge, they responded accordingly, and that makes me more optimistic. And I don't think that this depends on whether Mrs. Merkel is there or not. But maybe what I wanted to say is, obviously, if you have a leader been around for 16 years, that is something remarkable, and she's seen other European leaders come and go, and yes, it is something where she plays an important role for the development of Europe. But at the same time, it's also Germany's position. We are the biggest economy in the European Union, especially now that the Great Britain left the European Union. So we have a responsibility, and hence the strong coordination and cooperation, not only with France, but with the Polish, with the smaller member states, and so on and so on. And that is Germany's role, being in the middle of Europe.
So that brings us to the German EU presidency that starts in quite a few days on 1st of July. So far, Germany, the government is downplaying the role a bit, saying that it will be the moderator for Europe. But given the fact we have talked now about the upcoming election next year in Germany and in France the year after that, and the huge pressure from the crisis, from the coronavirus and other geopolitical challenges. So is it really realistic to say Germany can stay as a moderator, or what would you say, what are really the tasks given the pressure and the short time that remains until the next election?
Well, I would say the election and the presidency are not really linked, because as we all recall, and I will quote Churchill again, a week is a long time in politics. So over a year until the election in September 2021 is still far away. But this presidency will be a very special presidency, because it is really a COVID presidency. And this is true not only for the question whether all the different council meetings can take place as physical meetings, or do they need to be organized as video conferences with all the limitations that we know and see, but also obviously on the one pressuring item, and this is the post-corona reaction of the European Union. And that is why the whole question of the recovery fund and the strategy to overcome the crisis, the economic crisis that followed the health crisis, will be the cornerstone. So all these ideas we developed over the last year, 1.5 years in the different ministries and together with other colleagues and the Troika presidency, basically you have to reconsider and redo everything, because now there's one topic, and this is Corona in all the different aspects. So I think this will mark the presidency more than anything. Nevertheless, a presidency in Europe is always a moderating role, because you have to bring together the different positions of the 27 members, obviously having your own position as well. Somehow this moderating role is one that is also natural for Germany, and this is nothing new. But now we have this additional burden, if you want to say, on our shoulders to also have the presidency.
If I give you 6 keywords, let's say, that means health, recovery fund, budget, migration, trade, how would be your ranking of that? Shall I repeat? I can repeat it.
I would say recovery.
Yeah.
linked to that is the budget.
Yep.
Health. We have migration. No, this is and what was
Yep.
the two last ones?
Migration and trade.
Maybe
or
migration.
Perhaps you
and
want to
then
add, yeah.
Yeah, and then at the end it's difficult because this is, I mean, this is European politics, but this is politics nowadays. It's a lot of complexity. So you can't actually just say, okay, we have one piece on the table, let's deal with that one, let's finish that one, and then comes the next one. You have to deal with all these things at the same time. And obviously the budget is the most pressuring one because we have to finish it by the end of this year. The recovery fund is part of that budget. The whole question of recovery depends not only on the budget and recovery fund, but is overarching. Hopefully the the immediate health crisis we will overcome, and then migration and trade remain on the top of the agenda because the migration question did not miraculously disappear. It is still there, and the differences between the different member states, especially those that have borders, external borders, and those who are not willing to accept migrants or refugees. And the trade question is more important than ever because of the state of the world economy and the trade tensions we have with the Chinese, but also with the Americans. So I'd say it's more an intellectual exercise to try to prioritize these, because in reality, you have to deal with all of them simultaneously.
Perhaps let's go to a bit higher in a general conclusion. Do you think that the EU presidency is meant to come closer to a political union, to bring the European countries closer to a political union, or is it just to preserve the status quo?
That's tricky to say. I think what we need, and we saw that throughout the crisis, is a more political union. And so the question is whether the different member states are up to the task. But I think the status quo will not be enough.
Does since I have you here from the finance ministry as well, can you give us a little insider? Does the finance minister plan some special projects during the next 6 months for Europe? Will he surprise us with another proposal?
You never know, and the idea of a surprise would be a surprise. But I mean, there are several projects in the responsibility of the finance ministers, and so as we said, no, the budget is among them. You have even though it's negotiated by heads of states, and the foreign ministries are mainly responsible for it, but obviously at the end it's always the finance ministry to say, okay, we can do that or we can't. The whole question of the design of the recovery fund and how to implement it is with the finance ministers. And so forth. And then there is this question of the burden sharing that includes the necessity of minimum taxation, not only on the European, but also on the international level. And you know, because you followed these discussions throughout the last years, we have an issue with taxing the digital economy. We have a ongoing discussion on the international level in the framework of the OECD, and Olaf Scholz has been pushing a lot, and I think we achieved some breakthroughs, and now it is important to keep that item on the agenda, on the international agenda, based of the G20 and of the OECD, and there the presidency and the fact that you can kind of shape a little bit, at least, the European agenda might come in handy.
Since we are talking about leadership, it is a surprise to me that actually there are now 2 women in charge, let's say, to safeguard Europe. It's the German Chancellor and the Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen. Do you think this is just purpose, or is it a sign of progress?
I would not forget the third woman in that equation, and that is Madame Lagarde at the head of the ECB, which I think played a very crucial role from the very beginning in also fighting the crisis with this PEP program to have a new purchase program and to also send out a clear signal to markets. Personally, I think even though Mrs. von der Leyen and Mrs. Merkel and Mrs. Lagarde are not of the progressive part of the progressive movement, that it's good to have these women in these positions. Obviously, in the Commission, you have Franz Timmermans. In Germany, you have Olaf Scholz to help them do the right things.
If I may say that, it's all men. What about the women in the progressive part? Movement?
We have lots of progressive leaders in the movement. If you look at Denmark, for example, if you look at Finland, for example, so it's not a lack of women, I would say, but I'm just saying in these two institutions, you have progressives being the vice presidents or vice chancellor who are shaping the politics as well. And I wouldn't say this is only about men and women.
It is not, but also it's not only about women, men, but women and men. But it's so far. It's I mean, it's drawing attention that there are now three, as you say, three women in the driver's seat.
And
okay.
We have a fourth one. We have Kristalina Georgieva at the head of the International Monetary Fund. That is very important on the international level, and we are working very closely together with her. So indeed, there is a lot of women power at the moment. That's good.
That's good. Yeah, we will see. We will see. And let's come perhaps to the last point of our discussion. It's more a geopolitical point of view. So if we have a look to the US, we don't see only Madame Kristalina Georgieva, but also Mr. Trump. And we see the United States in a very, let's say, unusual position, almost close to a civil war there, with high infection rates. And on the other hand, we see Donald Trump pressing Germans again because of tariffs and the NATO payments. And we see China buying around the world all strategic infrastructure. So and now the question comes whether Europe can get a good position in this struggle, in this fight. So Macron always said it's a kind of a new sovereignty of Europe. How far or how close are we to that sovereignty?
If you look at what happened actually regarding trade, then I would say everybody should and is very happy that we have the European Commission and that it is their responsibility, so that it's not Germany, France, Spain, Italy negotiating with the US on tariffs, but it is the very strong European Union. So you have the over 300 million people in the US, a very important single market. And if even the Germans with 83 million would go to the US and try to negotiate, I'm pretty sure how the outcome would be. But there we are with 470 million Europeans with the single market and the power of that. So actually, this is a strong signal for what Macron called this new sovereignty and why it is so much needed. And that is why it is so important that we in Europe discuss about trade and develop a coherent and common strategy when it comes to trade.
But if you look into Europe, we see also a kind of blocks in Europe. It's the north against the south, it's the east, not against the west, but you know, there are you have these four blocks, and you see that countries are not coming closer together, but driving away from each other. So how can you overcome that? So what is the idea, the German idea to overcome that, or not only be seen as the best country or the strongest country in Europe, but also bringing the others together. So far, nothing really was successful. What is your recipe?
Well, I'm a member of the working group of optimists in politics, so I have a rather or slightly more positive view on what happened, and maybe also to explain what Olaf Scholz did when he started here. For him, it was pretty clear that Germany should not be the one lecturing other member states publicly or extended fingers and finger pointing or telling others to do their homework. And that is why, as I said, he started discussing with the other member states and the finance ministers in this case about their positions and their concerns. And I think this is also the recipe for dealing with other issues like the migration issue or trade issues or the budgetarian issues. It is never easy in politics. You always have different opinions, and as I said, we know this from the 16 states in Germany, and now you have it with 27 member states of the European Union. Yes, there are different opinions, there are different traditions, but at the end, it is my impression that all the leaders, all the politicians know that if they don't come to a common position, then even their position would be weakened. So it's politics at its best. You need to have leaders and politicians that know how to forge a compromise, and at the end you need that compromise, and then Europe can move ahead. And that is the task. That is the task for the presidency, but somehow this is the task for Germany and Europe, and this has been our task somehow.
That's almost a very good last word, but I would like to come to my question at the beginning, what your biggest goal for your career perhaps could be. So making Olaf Scholz Chancellor, or making Europe great again?
The question of the chancellorship of the SPD is not one that needs to be answered right now. And you know, the internal party procedures is the two chairmen of the party who have to do this job, and they will come up with a proposal, but in due time. At the moment, I think everybody in the German government, and this is true for all the governments around the world, we are working very hard on trying to mitigate the impact of this crisis, both when it comes to the health questions, but then now, especially in the finance ministry, when it comes to the economic impact it has. And so at the moment, we are working both on the national level, on the European level, and on the international level to overcome the crisis and to make sure that as many jobs, as many companies, as many businesses will survive this severe shock that we faced, and that is actually keeping me up day and night nearly, and everybody here at the ministry. So that is our main task at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Wolfgang Schmidt, for that interesting discussion and also the insiders in your work. We will see whether this was really a Hamiltonian moment or will be the Hamiltonian moment for the European Union. And now I would like to say goodbye and thank you. Auf Wiedersehen.